Hello, Read 581, and welcome to week 2. This week we are focused on assessment decisions and getting you ready to start working with your student. You have a few readings to do. First, I had on the syllabus for you to skim chapter 3 of Instructing Students. Honestly, I don't think that it is relevant for our purposes, so feel free to look and see what's in there, but we're not going to need it in this course, but it may be something you want to refer back to later. However, chapter 4 is all about assessing students' independent and instructional reading levels, so you'll definitely want to look at that. I also included for you to read the assess section for your student's assumed level if you purchase the Next Step Forward and Guided Reading text. So just a reminder, that text is broken down with a chapter for each of the different levels of reader. So emergent, early, transitional, fluent. So think about, where your student would fall. I'll remind you with that chart in a minute, and then look at the assess section, as that's going to hopefully give you some ideas for assessment. And then lastly, QRI 6, pages 22 through 35. Definitely read that to review giving the QRI, because you are likely going to start with the word list this week, but in addition, you may start with some passages as well. So definitely read Instructing Students Chapter 4 and the QRI 6. The others are just additional. Again, here's this chart I showed you last week just to help you understand, what chapter you want to look at in the Next Step Forward and Guided Reading. So here's the approximate grade range that corresponds with these reading stages. Again, this is going to be the approximate grade range of their reading level. So not necessarily the grade that they're currently in, but the grade that they're reading at. So you kind of need to have some idea of what grade they're reading at to determine what chapter you want to be looking in. Assignments due this week. Please submit your parent intake form and then the appropriate parent permission to video form as soon as possible. For legal reasons, you cannot begin working with the student until I have that on file, so get that in. Also, this week you are planning and conducting assessment session number 1 so that you can submit your assessment chart this week. As a reminder, all of the information pertaining to that assignment is in the Assignment 1 folder. There's a template, a sample, rubric, lots of good stuff, so make sure you look at that. You can also start to plan for assessment session number 2 this week. And then again, think about scheduling your coaching cycle meetings. These don't start until the end of September, so you have some time there. I'm also available during the school day if you will be working with a student at that time, and can set up times that are not listed. So send me an email if those times are not conducive for your your intervention sessions. Things to keep on your radar. Next week, you will submit assessment report number 2. So you're going to start the chart this week and input all the data and notes from your first assessment session. Next week, you're just going to add to it with the additional assessments. And then in week 4, you're going to type it into that formal report. So that's what's due week 4, September 19th. So really need to get all of your assessments done weeks 2 through 4 so that assessment report is ready to go and you're ready to start intervention week 5. A reminder about what all these important forms are, but pay special attention to these last 2 because those are the ones that I need from you. All right, let's dig into assessment decisions and what assessments to get ready for your student this week. We are still focused on the first course objective, which pertains to literacy assessment, the ability to analyze observation and assessment results in order to identify strengths and needs. This is what we're doing the first 4 weeks of the course, so we'll continue on with that. Last week, as a reminder, we talked about focusing on what can your student do. and looking at how fluent are they. And remember that fluency is not just rate, but also accuracy and prosody. How well do they comprehend what they are reading? Thinking about the range of comprehension from literal to inferential to critical and beyond. What does their word solving look like in reading and in writing? How well do they write? And then how much do they enjoy reading and writing? How confident do they feel? So I already went over different assessment tools you could use to assess those different components of reading. You may want to reacquaint yourself with these slides and this information to give you ideas with tools available for you. So this is in word solving. So in order to look at word solving in context, the QRI running record is a great way. Any record of oral reading is a great way to look at word solving in context. Word solving in isolation, you can just use the QRI word list to take a look at that. And if you're noticing that a student is struggling with word solving either in context or in isolation, you want to dig in and go deeper and do a phonics survey like the core phonics survey or the BPST. And then, if they're really having issues with CVC words and blends and that sort of thing, you're going to want to go deeper and look at phonemic awareness. If phonemic awareness seems to be an issue, go deeper and look at concepts about print. So you don't necessarily need to do concepts about print and phonemic awareness, and phonics. Just if you are perceiving a need, you want to keep going down these skills. Also want to look at word solving in writing. So looking at words in context by doing a sort of audit on their draft writing, and then also words in isolation by doing a developmental spelling inventory, which we'll talk about later in this screencast. When you assess writing, make sure you're looking at the process of how they're approaching the task, as well as the product that they come away with at the end. And then lastly, but I encourage you to start with this, is to get an indicator for how they feel about reading and writing. And that is how we wrapped up last week, was thinking about the affective domain, which includes motivation and engagement, attitudes toward reading and writing, writing interests, and confidence in reading, writing, self-perception. So hopefully last week you were able to identify some different tools you can use to measure the affective domain, because that is what I would start with for your assessment session, really getting to know your student and their interests and how they feel about reading and writing. So let's move on and talk about creating your assessment schedule and calendar and how to determine what assessments to give and what my recommendation is. So last week I shared this slide with you as ideas for for session 1. Definitely parent interview needs to be happening. So hopefully you found something for that. Additionally, the interest inventory attitude survey should happen, as well as something for motivation, self-concept, the motivation to read profile or the adolescent motivation to read profile are my preferred tools for that. And then QRI 6 word list should be given so that you can prepare the passages either for session 2 or beyond. And you might even decide to start the QRI 6 passages. You could do the core phonics survey if that would be appropriate for your student's grade and developmental level. But if they're able to read multisyllabic words and they're decoding well in context, you probably won't need to do a phonics survey. So just really pay attention to if this is necessary or not. And then the words their way spelling inventory is required for everyone. And actually the assessments that are bold, I'm going to talk about in this screencast because they are very important and will need to be given by everyone. So these were talked about last week. You should be giving those session 1. This I'll talk about now, as well as this. So those are my suggestions for week 1. In Next Steps Forward, what's nice is in the assess section of each of these stages of reading, they give you suggested assessments. So the emergent readers, those are our kinder students, levels A through C. They suggest doing a letters and sounds assessment, some sort of running record, giving them a dictated sentence, because if you just say, write about a time you were sad, or happy, or had a good day, they might not, be able to create something from nothing essentially and go through that whole writing process yet. So it might be easier for them if you controlled the text and gave them a dictated sentence. And then lastly, some indicator for sight words to see how they're developing in that area. For early readers, they suggest a reading conference, which would be like your QRI, as well as a spelling assessment. So like the Words Their Way assessment. So when teachers ask me, what should I prioritize for diagnostic assessments? These are the two that you want to prioritize because they give you the most information that's going to really help you with your instructional decision making. So I always recommend some sort of informal reading inventory that measures oral reading fluency plus comprehension, as well as a spelling indicator. As we know, spelling, your developmental spelling stage is a more conservative measure. It means that you can definitely read those words, whereas if I can read it, I can't necessarily write it. So it's better to assess spelling because that guarantees that the child can actually read those words. And typically, the words that they can write is about, a year behind or a level behind the words that they can read. So just a note about that. Then for transitional readers and fluent readers, same thing, some sort of word knowledge inventory, like the Words Their Way spelling inventory, and then a reading conference. So those two are definitely going to need to happen. That's what this screencast is going to be focused around. But, we have the luxury of having more time to give diagnostic assessments and really digging in deeper. So it's likely that you're going to be giving more than just a word knowledge inventory and some form of reading conference. So I wanted to actually show you some agendas I've used in the past when I've structured my reading assessment sessions. So this is from a 6th grade student that I worked with. Our first session, I did a get to know you activity, which was an M&M game where, we each had a few M&Ms, and based on the color, I had a key. So, red, tell me something you love. Brown, tell me something you don't love. Blue, tell me a hope or a dream. Orange is wild. You can tell me anything. Green, if you had $100, how would you spend it? So just a fun little get to know you activity, but, still kind of helped me get to know her and her interests. Then we did the MRP here. And then from that, we did the QRI word list. And then, based on their performance, you're going to need to go up or down. So I'll talk about this more in a minute, but you should prepare a word list 2 years below their grade level so they feel successful and confident. So since she was 6th grade, I started with 4th grade. And then, you go up until they hit frustration and down until they hit independent. And then Words Their Way spelling inventory was the last thing. So I felt like this was a good manageable amount. I didn't want to overwhelm her. The information I had was that she is a reluctant reader, so didn't want to do too much, cognitive work this day so that, she would be enthusiastic about our next session. At our next session, my focus was doing the QRI. So based on the word list results, she scored instructional at upper middle school. So I gave part 1 and part 2 of the upper middle school QRI. Part 1, she read aloud to me. And then part 2 was a silent read with stopping points. And as you'll read in the QRI assigned reading for this week, For those, older students, having them read silently is more appropriate than having them read aloud. So I wanted to see kind of both since I'd never listened to her read before. And then for our last assessment session, I went based on her performance on the upper middle school. I could tell this was definitely instructional / frustration with the comprehension. So I went down to grade 6 and did this is a narrative biography and then this is expository. So you want to make sure that you are measuring reading ability for different text types because typically narrative is a little bit easier for students than expository is, but it's very important for middle school students to be able to have the skill and facility to read these these expository passages fluently and with comprehension. So this was how I structured my 3 assessment sessions. You'll notice that there isn't any focus on writing. So, this is a partial example, not the best example because you want to make sure that you are having some indicator to see the process and product of actual writing. I did do the spelling inventory, but you need a more comprehensive writing assessment. So let's switch gears and talk about the QRI. There are 3 main purposes for giving it. It helps you determine the student's independent, instructional, and or frustration levels, which is very important for shaping instruction. We know that independent level texts are ones they can read without any support. So these are great for them to, read during independent reading time or at home for leisure and enjoyment because they don't need support and they're not going to struggle with it. The instructional level is really important because that's where we're going to be teaching them at. It's their zone of proximal development. And then frustration level is going to be the level below their instructional level. We want to avoid, putting them in frustration level text because that's going to lead to negative self-perceptions and negative views of reading. Another purpose of QRI is to help you assess the student's ability to read different types of text and then also assess their ability to comprehend in different modes. So oral reading and how, comprehension is with that versus silent reading and their comprehension of that. How well are they monitoring what they're reading silently, orally, etc.? Is there a difference or not? So when giving the QRI 6, there is a script on pages 27 to 28. You really should follow the script to ensure that you are administering this assessment with high reliability. So the script goes over, what to say for the word list, the concept questions, the passages, the retelling, and the questions. So you definitely want to start with the word list. And you use the word list to find the student's independent instructional frustration level. So then you know what passage to provide. So this is a quick and easy way to determine where you start with the passages. So begin with the word list 2 or more years below the student's chronological grade. It's going to give you a quick estimate of their word identification skill that will help you determine where to start with your passage. So their performance on the word list is not going to tell you their reading level. That's what the passage is for. But the word list performance will tell you what passage to give next so that you aren't wasting your time giving a ton of different passages. The passages are very time consuming. They can take, 30 minutes per passage. So you don't want to be wasting your time. You want to start with the word list to determine what passage to start with. Word identification in isolation is a rough predictor of the level of a passage that the student can read and comprehend. These can also be used as a word solving assessment for words in isolation. So it's highly recommended that if the student substitutes a different word for the word on the word list, that you write it down and then you can later analyze those miscues to see, kind of what they're doing, see if there's any noticeable trends or patterns to the miscues they're making on the word list. Remember to keep track of automatic pronunciation by saying 1001. in your head. So the goal is for the student to really recognize these quickly. And on the, word list notation sheet, you're either checking off, did they say it automatically, or, did they identify it kind of eventually? We want them to be able to readily recall these words. And it's a good idea to audio record everything. That way you're not as pressured to take notes on the spot if you happen to miss something. And it's also distracting to the student if, you're over there doing a bunch of notations on your sheet. They might be more interested in what you're writing than what they're reading, and they might be worried about their performance. So best practice would be to audio record everything and then go back and do all of your notes. All right, so scoring the word list, all you have to do is count up the number of words identified automatically, and those identified. The total number correct will tell you what passage level to start with to assess the child's reading level. Whatever word list you start at, go up until you hit frustration and go down in grade until you hit independent. So there was some confusion previously with a grad student, where they thought, you give the word list and then you give that same level passage, and then you give the next word list and then the passage. No. You're giving all, the word lists you need to find the student's instructional independent frustration level. So again, start 2 years below your child's grade level, and then go up until you hit frustration and down until you hit independent. So here's a sample of my student. Again, she was 6th grade, so I started with 4th grade. She did really well in that, really well in 5th grade, really well in 6th grade, and then she hit instructional at upper middle school. So I knew that that is where I wanted to start with my passage. Oh, notice with the QRI word list, they want you to write a C for correct responses. And then, you want to, as best as possible, notate the pronunciation they give. So for her, she was just kind of awkwardly reading some of these multisyllabic words. It could have been a vocabulary issue, actually, for things like infrared, nebula, inevitable. So definitely try to notate as much as possible what the student is doing that's causing the issue. Here's another example for a lower grade student, a 1st grader actually. So, 1st grade, I went down 2 levels. She did independent on the pre-primer 2-3, instructional on the primer, and then frustration on 1st grade. So want to start with primer for my passages. So, here I'm notating what she's saying, a lot of, visually similar. So one thing interesting to look at is, these words on the word list are taken from the passages. So I could look and see, did she get the word thing in context, or did she say think for that? DK is don't know. So ride, read, same initial and ending sound, but not attending to the vowel there. Again, run, ran, not attending to the vowel. So you can actually, notice a lot from just the word list, words in isolation. They tell you a lot about the word solving strategy. So which passage do I start with? You start with the narrative passage that corresponds to the lowest instructional level attained on the word list. So the lowest word list with at least 70% correct. So if the student scores independent at 1st grade, instructional at 2nd grade, instructional at 3rd grade, and frustration at 4th, you want to start with the level 2 passage so that they feel more successful. So even though they had instructional on 3rd, you want to start with the lowest instructional level, just so that they feel successful. All right, once you've given your word lists, that will help you know which passage to give. The next step then is to prepare your passages. And for session 1, you may want to, if your student is a 6th grader, You may want to prepare passages for 4, 5, 6, and if you have time, you could hopefully, give one of those, or maybe you want to prepare 5, 6 in upper middle school so that you have a range of assessments ready to go. If you have time, you could give one of those and knock it out, because they are time consuming and can take a lot of your assessment time. So the first part of the QRI is assessing the prior knowledge. They have concept questions, and what's nice is on QRI 6, they give you target responses and how to score them. So you don't really need to pay as much attention to this. Before, you kind of had to know how to assign your points, but they tell you on the scoring sheets how to score those. It's important to know we're looking for a score of 55% or better. That implies that concept that the passage is on is a familiar concept to the student. And, it's best to find a familiar passage initially, because the narrative familiar passage is going to be the best indicator of their highest instructional level, whereas an unfamiliar expository passage is typically the one that's going to be their lowest instructional level. So want to start by finding a familiar narrative passage that they can do well, and that is stated on page 25 that you'll read this week. They also talk about for older students, though, unfamiliar expository may be suitable for students in 4th grade and above, because that is more what they are reading in class. But definitely want to find how they perform on both narrative and expository, and note, the familiarity of the topic, because a lot of times that can influence the performance. If I don't have any knowledge of this concept, it's going to be hard for me to retrieve some of the vocabulary terms that are going to be in there and just have a general level of comprehension on that passage. All right, so if they have prior knowledge, continue by introducing the passage, timing the student as they read, coding their reading of the passage, removing the passage, and having them retell as many details as possible. And then after they've retold everything, have them answer the comprehension questions. You can have them do as best they can without looking back, and then offer the look back, and then just note, did they need to look back? And when they did look back, were they able to quickly find the information they needed? How to record oral miscues. You may want to reacquaint yourself with the running record notation. So for substitutions, you write what they said above the word. Omissions, you circle the omitted word. Insertions, you caret with the new word. Self-corrections, you mark that with a C. Reversals, you do a little sigmoidal curve around the two words reversed. Punctuation ignored, you can X out what's ignored, but that's not counted against them. Miscues that change the meaning, you can mark with MC. So these conventions vary slightly from traditional running record conventions. If they aren't able to identify a word, gently ask him or her to skip it and move on. You don't want to be giving them any words, because likely that word will come up later in the passage and will not only influence the accuracy of their reading, but also their comprehension if you're giving them, key content words to the passage. That's going to help them comprehend better. Repetitions, hesitations, and self-corrections are not counted as errors. So here's a look at what that notation looks like. So here's a substitution. The child said wet for warm, which changes the meaning. Went for were, which also changes the meaning. Here's an omission. Here's an insertion, another omission. So you may want to practice doing a few of these. Next week, I'm going to talk more on the analysis of the QRI assessment. This week, it's more about getting you ready to give it. And then next week, we'll kind of dig into what to look at on the QRI. So if you do happen to give a QRI this week, you can always go back next week and add to your analysis of that. So I'll make sure not to grade you too harshly if the analysis isn't as deep on the QRI, because we haven't talked about that yet. I know this was all covered in 516. I'm just not sure how much so. So want to make sure everyone has the information they need to be successful. So with QRI, you can measure total accuracy and total acceptability in order to determine the reading level. So this just lets you know that all of these are counted as miscues for total accuracy, but for total acceptability, it's just the meaning changing miscues. Here's some special circumstances to be aware of. Oops, sorry, went too far. If they miscue on a proper name, it's only counted as one miscue, even if it's repeated over and over again. If they miscue on the same word, but it makes sense in the passage, it too is only counted as one miscue. And if they omit an entire line, that is also just counted as one miscue because it represents a loss of place, not necessarily a lack of knowledge of all of those words that they missed in that line. So your QRI will tell you that in order for it to be the child's independent level, they have to get 98% plus accuracy and 90% plus comprehension. So if they have that 98% plus accuracy, but at 85% comprehension, that's their instructional level. For instructional level, they need 90 to 97% accuracy and at least a 70 to 88% comprehension. And then frustration level is anything lower than 90% for accuracy and lower than 70% for comprehension. If your student scores at independent or instructional in the first passage, choose another familiar narrative passage at the next higher level and continue going up until the student reaches frustration. If, however, they are at frustration on your first passage, move downward until you reach their instructional level. So you want to give a range of QRIs to be able to, speak to the child's independent and instructional level. Evaluating automaticity, page 49 gives you a chart for that. It also tells you how to calculate words per minute, correct words per minute. And then QRI 6 is awesome because it includes a prosody rating scale that wasn't present in the QRI 5. Scoring the retell is pretty straightforward. There's directions on pages 53 to 57. It's not used to determine the child's reading level, but helps you get a sense of how well they can recall information read at the literal level. And all you have to do is place a check next to each of those ideas explicitly stated, or you can get fancy and you can sequence the recalled ideas by using a number. So, the first thing they recalled, put a 1 next to that. The second thing they say in the recall, put a 2. So that'll kind of help you see the order of information they're recalling. Are they doing it sequentially, or are they kind of hopping back and forth? So that's an option for you as well. Questions are also straightforward. They give you explicit questions, which the answers are right there in the text, whereas the implicit questions are inferential. The authors recommend no half points, and they also recommend using lookbacks, especially for grades 3 and up, because those texts are more dense, more complex, and we as readers might not recall every little thing we read, but we know, how to go back and reference that section in order to find the information. So to determine levels, I just went over that, but it's also on page 52. A few variations to keep in mind. You can use the QRI to measure silent reading comprehension, and you can even compute a words per minute for that, because you just start your timer and then whenever they finish, stop it. And then you can calculate, their words per minute based on the total time. It won't tell you words correct per minute because you don't know how many miscues they had during that amount of time. You can also use the QRI to assess comprehension through lookbacks for level 3 and up, and then assess comprehension through think alouds for level 6 and up, which I found very helpful with my 6th grade student, really having her stop and tell me what she's thinking about as she's reading. And I noticed that she really doesn't know how to kind of stop and process text throughout the reading. And so that was my focus for our intervention sessions, actually. All right, last assessment I want to talk about is the Words Their Way spelling inventory. It is required. Note that there are 3 different levels. The primary spelling inventory is suggested for grades K through 3. For kinder, you can just give the first 5 words. If they do well with that, you can keep going. For grade 1, you can give the first 15. For grades 2 and 3, you can give all 25. We just wrapped up a summer reading clinic that was a fabulous experience, and this was one of the assessments we used. And even though they were students going into first grade, we still gave them all 25 because we wanted to really see performance on all 25 of the words from the beginning to the end. So in order to have a direct comparison, you need to give the same amount of words at the beginning and the end. So just keep that in mind. If you only give the first 5 words, but then later give 10 words, you can't really directly compare, how many feature points they got initially because you limited, the feature points possible versus, if you're giving them more opportunity for success on the post-test. So very important, whatever you give for the pre-test, you need to give on the post-test. So I would give more unless they're pulling out their hair and yelling at you. I would try to give as many as you possibly can. If they get 20 words right or more, move to the elementary spelling inventory. That is recommended for grades 1 through 6. You can discontinue that if the student is visibly frustrated or misses 5 in a row, but I would try and give as many of it as possible. And then lastly is the upper level spelling inventory suggested for grades 5 through 12. Steps for this, really straightforward. Select the spelling inventory you're going to give based on their grade and developmental level. Give it like a spelling test. It should take 20 to 30 minutes. Have the student number their paper. For younger kids, you may want to do that for them ahead of time. Pronounce each word naturally without drawing out sounds or breaking it into syllables. So you don't want to give them any hints on how the word is spelled. You want to make sure you're pronouncing it naturally. Say each word twice, use it in a sentence, circulate and monitor their performance. The beauty of this is it can be given in a small group or a whole group, so it's a great assessment to get a lot of rich data for a class if you're limited on time. When you see signs of frustration, be prepared to stop. And then you analyze the student spellings using the feature guide. So here's a sample assessment given to Jake. This looks like the elementary spelling inventory. I'm pretty sure it's the ESI. What you want to do first is look at the words and write down, the correct word next to their attempt. So you can kind of see a comparison there. And then what you're going to do is check off each So first you look at the whole words and you write down, those words that are spelled incorrectly. You put the correct spelling next to it and then count up the total words that they have correctly. So that's going to be written down here. He has 9 words spelled correctly, and these check marks show all of his 9 words spelled correctly. In the first word, he has all the sounds, all the features. So you're checking off every feature that he has correctly within these words. So it looks like he had all of the consonant sounds, 7 out of 7, all of the short vowels, 5 out of 5, all of the digraphs, 6 out of 6, and all of the blends, 7 out of 7. So he did really well in those features. However, instead of IGH, he put I blank E. So that's how you're notating that they missed something. You're writing what they wrote instead. So for OI, he put OY. So here he had 4 out of 5. Here he had 5 out of 7. So this is how we know where instruction should begin, where the student misses 2 or more. That's where we want to start instruction. So he falls in the late within word spelling stage. You're then going to total up how many features he received. So he got 43 out of 62 feature points. You add the words spelled correctly with the feature points to get an overall total. And so this really gives you a quantitative measure of spelling performance that you can then compare from, the beginning of your work with the student to the end of your work. So first, I gave my student, so she was a sixth grader. So since the elementary spelling inventory is grades 1 through 6, I first gave her this. She flew through it. And although she missed 1, 2, 3, 4 words, she only missed 3 features, and this placed her in the late derivational relations stage. And it didn't really give me a lot of information to shape instruction. This only gave me 3 things to instruct on. So I went ahead and then gave her the upper level spelling inventory, which definitely helped me perceive a lot more need. And actually this, placed her in the late syllables and affixes stage and gave me some affixes she needed to work on here and here. So this was more informative for my instructional purposes. So if a student does too well on something like the QRI or the words their way, that doesn't give you much to analyze really or to use to plan instruction. You can't do a miscue analysis on an independent level running record because they aren't making very many miscues. So you kind of want to find the level where they might have some difficulty, because that will help you see the direction you need to take with instruction. Notes on scoring with the words their way. Reversals should be noted but not counted against them. So if letters are facing the wrong direction, that's not counted against them. Static reversal is where the B is written backwards in bed. A kinetic reversal is where the letters are out of order, which they do get credit for having, the correct features, but they don't get a point for spelling the word correctly. And again, instruction begins where the student makes 2+ errors on a feature. If you want more practice scoring, here's some sample results that you can practice scoring, but pretty straightforward, just to check next to all the features they have correct, and then, write down their spelling of the features they missed and tally it up and look for where they made 2 or more errors, and that tells you their level of performance and where you want to start instruction for your intervention sessions. So in planning your assessments, I want you to go back and think about those introductory questions. How are they with fluency? How are they with word solving? How are they with comprehension, with writing, with their perceptions of themselves and interest in reading? To determine the tools you will need, you're then going to create an assessment plan for session 1. And I gave you some ideas, but ultimately it's up to you, and it's going to be dependent on your student, their, grade level, their developmental level, their needs, their attitudes, that sort of thing. And then think of your tentative plan for session 2 and 3, and then be prepared to adjust your assessment plan based on your results. So that is your goal for this week, is to start assessing that affective domain, get your QRI word list done. If you want to start a passage, that's a good idea, and definitely do the words their way spelling inventory. And that's what I got. If you have questions, concerns, feel free to email me. And then next week, we'll talk about more assessments as well as digging into the results of the QRI and what to look at and how to report those, and a little miscue analysis. So have a great week. Have a great start with your student, and good luck to you.